to another episode of One Room Schoolhouse. My name's Jonathan.
I'm Tim.
And today we want to talk to you about the father of our nation, George Washington. He's somebody who I hope everybody has heard of. I've certainly heard of him. I'm sure, Tim, you've heard of him
I've read a few things about him.
Yeah,
seems familiar.
Kind of an important guy.
I remember as a kid I had a lot of $1 bills, and now I wish I had more money in general, but yes.
George Washington obviously is somebody who is a major figure in American history, but we're starting to see a tendency now to kind of take him down, right? Statues have come down to George Washington. Schools that were named after him have been renamed or in the process of being renamed. And a lot of it has to deal with the wrong view of who George Washington was. And what's interesting is this actually isn't a new tendency. In fact, it goes all the way back to the Revolutionary War period. This right here is a letter from George Washington. It was printed after it was written, and what's fascinating is that this letter by Washington says the American Revolution was a mistake. This was written at the very beginning of the war, that God is not going to bless the revolutionaries, that they're all basically going to die and be killed by the British, and it will be worse than when we started. Now this, to those listening at home, it might come as a surprise for anybody who knows anything about George Washington. And you're right for being surprised, because this is a fake letter.
Fake news.
Fake news, fake history. It was a forgery done in an attempt to discourage the Americans by a newspaper editor in New York. Which, right, if you know anything about newspaper editors and newspapers stationed in New York, they continue to have a reputation for not being very good. And that is pointed at the New York Times specifically.
Yeah, just in case, if you're watching, if you're wondering,
to call you out.
It's you haven't done a good job. And what's crazy about some of this too is that arguably America would not be a nation without George Washington. Right? The reason he's known as the father of the nation, he was the guy in charge through the American Revolution, leading the American military. When it's time to write a constitution, he's the guy in charge of the Constitutional Convention. There are people who credit him with being the only reason we actually got a constitution, because of all the frustrations and disagreements of the guys who were there. He's the first president of our nation, the only president ever elected unanimously by the Electoral College. This is a very important guy, and yet today, people want to point to maybe a character flaw he had, or lies that are being told about him, and say he should not be honored, he shouldn't be celebrated, he shouldn't be remembered favorably because he was not a good person. As you mentioned, it's not a brand new thought or idea, because even back in the Revolution, people were trying to discredit Washington. It's just that in earlier times in American history, people knew enough of who he was that they knew about his character, they knew about his leadership, his contributions to America, that they weren't going to be easily misled. A lot of that has changed over the centuries. In fact, we have several books that actually document some of that change. This was a book called The Image and the Man about George Washington. It was done by W.E. Woodward. This came out in 1926. When this came out, it was highlighting that Washington is not the man you might have heard of before, and it was emphasizing some brand new details that had been overlooked historically, etc. By the way, anytime somebody says we have brand new information that nobody's ever found before, be a little skeptical unless they're showing you the original document. If you see the original document, then you can go, wow, if that's original and that's authentic, that's a cool piece of new history, but that's not what W.E. Woodward did. In fact, he inserts a lot of opinions where he says, here's what I think Washington felt or believed.
I feel like he would have done this, or he thought this, or that she said this. I mean, it basically almost reads kind of like a high school drama, right? I feel like Washington really was this type of guy.
And it highlights that he was a person who had an affair with Sally Fairfax. And so the point is, this book was done to highlight that Washington was a very flawed man. He wasn't a man of good character like so many Americans thought of. So this was 1926. In 1927, a new book came out. It was The Greatest of Men, Washington. And this was done largely as a defense of George Washington, pointing out that the book that came out last year flawed on so many levels, and it defends a lot of the character, the honorableness of George Washington. But you see in the 1920s, attacks on the character of George Washington. Then in the 1940s, there was another book that came out, Our Lusty Forefathers, and this actually went through several founding fathers, and it accused them of having affairs, and in many cases just making up things that didn't exist, that weren't historically true, like what happened with W.E. Woodward saying that George Washington had an affair with Sally Fairfax. But this is part of the history that was unfolding, and because of this, There are even people today that believe a lot of negative things about the Founding Fathers that were not true historically, but they say, wait a second, but there's books from the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s that say these bad things, therefore they must be true. Just because a professor says it doesn't mean it's true. And one of the things that used to be done is we would say, let's go back to original sources. Let's go back to people who knew Washington or to Washington's own writings and read for ourselves what was there. The problem is today a lot of the narrative is being shaped not by original documents. It's being shaped in exclusion of original documents, just quoting some professor or maybe some newspaper from New York, right? Well, that's a very bad view and bad take of history, but this is a lot of the story being done to George Washington.
That's right. And one of the kind of our favorite examples to highlight this are these two books right here. Now, I have the old original edition of a book called The Maxims of Washington. And what it is, this gentleman went through and collected hundreds of quotes out of Washington's original writings and ordered them based on the topic. So whether it was, what did Washington think about politics? What did he think about policy? What did he think about family? And specifically, what did he think about faith? What was Washington's religious view?
And let's also point out, so the guy who actually compiled Washington's first volume collection of letters was Jared Sparks. And so today there's actually, you can go and read the letters of Washington, and there are books, volumes of books, more than 100 volumes of books of just Washington's letters and writings. So you actually can go and see things that Washington actually wrote. The guy who collected the very first set of those letters to make the very first sets of volumes of Washington's letters was Jared Sparks. Well, Jared Sparks, after compiling those letters from Washington, was a guy that now he's noted as kind of this Washington historian. There's a new guy who kind of enters the scene and says, we want to see from all of these collection of letters of Washington, what did Washington think about all these things? So Schroeder's the guy who actually came out with what was known as the Maxims of Washington. And it went through the different, as Jonathan, as you pointed out, the different themes of what did he say regarding to politics or to religion or to the military or education. And so Schroeder goes through by topic and says, here's some really brilliant things that Washington wrote in these letters from this collection that Jared Sparks put together. So this was the Maxims of Washington, but there's a unique way that Schroeder introduces each of those sections.
That's right. For every section that he's going into, he includes quotes from people who knew Washington, eyewitnesses or experts on Washington, but mostly eyewitnesses' accounts to Washington's faith, to his Christianity, to his virtues and things of that nature. So it's a really good way to introduce who he was by going back to the people who actually knew him.
Yeah, so just for example, when it gets to the section on religion, on faith, it breaks it up with some of Washington's statements about God. Well, this is his statements about Christianity. And as you see, there's an introduction where people that knew Washington said, here's what we knew about the general. And let me just read you a few things it says. This one, for example, says he was a sincere believer in the Christian faith. This one says the general was a Christian. This one says he was a professor of Christianity. These were people largely who personally knew George Washington, who served with him in the military, or maybe when Washington was the president, they were in Congress. And so these were people, largely speaking, who had a great relationship or personal knowledge of George Washington. And they're saying, well, if we're going to talk about Christianity and what he said in regards to Christianity, you should know that he, in fact, was a Christian. Now, these are people who personally knew him, again, largely speaking, personally knew him, had encounters with him, were friends with him, and they said he was a Christian. Well, this was the original Maxims of Washington. There have been modern reprints of it, though.
Like this one right here. This is actually a modern reprint from 1989. And what's interesting and noticeably different about this edition from the original is that they have deleted all of the original eyewitness testimonies about George Washington's faith, his Christianity, and things of that nature, and instead have replaced it with a modern introduction by a academic, a professor of history. And what's fascinating is the professor decides to disagree with wholly the basically universal testimony of the people who knew Washington. Instead of Washington being this obvious Christian, as the people who knew him said, Washington is now a deist, somebody who doesn't believe in an act of God and things of that nature. So it's incredible to see that right, all of a sudden now, over 200 years after the fact, we can disregard the people who knew Washington and just trust the experts.
So one of the things that's worth noting in this is, Jonathan, you mentioned that we're not going to trust the eyewitness accounts anymore. Just notice even part of the reasoning from this historian as to why Washington would never be a Christian. Here's what he argues. A product of the Enlightenment, Washington's term for God included divine author of our blessed religion, divine providence, and the almighty being who rules over the universe. Like many deists, and he goes on to explain that Washington was a deist. Now, this is what is largely continuing to happen with American history is we're no longer looking at original sources. The modern narrative is being reshaped by whatever a professor says, by whatever a politician says. And because people don't know what's actually true, we're buying into this. If you go back to people that actually knew George Washington, there was a lot of recognition that Washington was in fact a Christian by people that knew him. Now today, a lot of people have heard Washington wasn't a Christian. That's something that might be a modern narrative. It certainly wasn't the thought of people from that day that knew him. For example, George Washington and Martha actually adopted 2 of their grandkids. And they actually came and lived with George and Martha in Mount Vernon for nearly 20 years. One of those was Nellie Park Custis. Actually, when Jared Sparks was collecting the original volume of all of Washington's letters, he wrote to Nellie and said, is there anything important that we should know, maybe specifically pertaining to his faith? And Nellie wrote back and said that he, of course, was a Christian. Anybody that questions that would just be silly. And she points out that you should sooner question his patriotism than question his Christianity. That was somebody that lived with him for 20 years, saying that, of course, he was a Christian. And she's not the only one avowing to his Christian faith.
That's right. We can actually go back to many of the pastors and ministers of the gospel who specifically and personally knew George Washington, and they universally testified to his sincere and devout and genuine faith. And so one of those is Reverend Lee Massey, who was actually the rector of the church, one of the churches where Washington served as a vestryman. So a church where Washington is actually not only a member, but engaged in what's going on. And Lee Massey says, "I never knew so constant an attendant at church as Washington, and his behavior in the house of God was ever so deeply reverential that it produced the happiest effect on my congregation and greatly assisted me in my pulpit labors. No company ever withheld him from church." So here is a minister of the gospel saying George Washington was extremely helpful in spreading the gospel. Now, that doesn't sound like somebody who's not a Christian. And I mean, we could keep on going.
And he was a faithful church attender, is what he also says. But yeah, literally, we can go through dozens, if not hundreds, of people that talked about his Christian faith. Now, of course, I understand there can be questions, there can be accusations. That's fine. We can even have honest conversations about, well, based on the evidence we found, here's what we think. That's a great conversation to have based on actual original sources and evidence. And unfortunately, too often today, people are forming opinions based on what some professor says or based on what maybe Wikipedia says or what some news outlet might write. We need to be a lot wiser than that and recognize that the father of our nation, so to speak, George Washington, he really was somebody who deservingly was honored, because America largely wouldn't exist today if it wasn't for people like him, and even specifically George Washington, what he did for this nation. As we do so much work here at WallBuilders trying to help retell the story, one of the things that we have done recently to help get this story out, and largely the American story in general, we have a book called The American Story. And in this, we go from really Christopher Columbus kind of up through the end of slavery in America, through the abolition movement, to the end of the Civil War, highlighting just so many of these individuals, the stories, the heroism involved, and even we highlight some of the villains and where there had to be some major overcoming for Americans in this journey for America to become a nation that she really should be. So it's a great way to learn more of the story, learn more of who Washington was and so many of the other heroes. Go to wallbuilders.com for more information. Also to get the American story, wallbuilders.com, or just tune in next time for another episode of One Room Schoolhouse.